sour soup corn noodles that the family had eaten is called swantangzi. Mother MC had prepared it 1 year earlier following the traditional process. When it was freshly made, some family members had also eaten it and nothing happened. Everyone had a nutritious meal. But when it was defrosted and prepared this second time, something had gone wrong. Food is frozen because the 0-degree temperature inactivates the bacteria and molds that cause poisoning. Isn't sudden kidney and liver failure happening on the order of minutes to hours after eating the food. It's very unlikely that bacteria or fungus could do this quickly. This rules out an infectious cause of their problems, meaning that a toxin or a poison is somehow involved, and it's involved with the noodles when they were thawed and prepared the second time. But it's not just their kidneys and liver shutting down now, but also their brain, because BC, DC, and SC have all become unconscious. Just before one of the family members had fallen ill, they had called Ace to tell them that they were going to the hospital. No one else could be reached because everyone was becoming ill. In a rush, Ace left work. He only expected the one who contacted him to be sick, but when he arrived to the hospital, he got to the department. When the doctor brought him to the room, her suspicions were confirmed. Everyone here was family, and to Ace's shock, almost his entire family was here. Given that he was the only one who didn't eat these noodles that morning, it prompted the doctor to give more information to the public health authorities. At the local office, investigators immediately started to take a look. In less than 24 hours, they were able to get samples of the exact noodles that were eaten during that breakfast. Realizing that these were homemade, it gave them some relief because a commercial product would have been distributed more widely. But this wouldn't preclude the possibility that contaminated ingredients used to make these noodles could be out in the public. In the hospital, Ace was in disbelief, but it wasn't finished. A fourth patient, MC, a 44-year-old woman, was admitted to the hospital with the same nausea, vomiting, and diffuse bleeding before she fell unconscious while receiving treatment. Ace, in a panic, had no idea what to do. His entire family was in this room just hours after eating breakfast, celebrating a holiday. The liver is one of the largest organs in the body. Because of this size, a substantial percentage of the body's blood is flowing through it at any given time. It's one of the most metabolically active parts of the body because it chemically processes everything that passes through it, meaning that it needs a lot of energy. Do you remember DC's hyperammonemia? It happened because his liver couldn't process proteins into urea anymore, leaving it as ammonia. The liver needs energy to perform this conversion, but because this conversion isn't happening anymore, then we could say that there might be something wrong with the liver's energy production. When DC, BC, SC, and MC all presented to the emergency room, they had hyperglycemia. But hours after being admitted into the hospital, repeat blood tests find that they all have hypoglycemia, low sugar presence in blood. If sugar is supposed to be used by cells to make energy, and everyone's blood sugar suddenly went from high to low, and their livers aren't performing functions that require a lot of energy, then what exactly is happening? Well, human nutrition is made of 3 macronutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. These all get converted to energy in the body. We just established that every family member who fell ill is having problems with not only carbohydrates, but they're also having problems with proteins as well. But what about fats? CT scans of everyone's abdomen at admission found fatty deposits all over everyone's liver. The liver tried to release sugar because the body thought cells needed it to make more energy, but then those stores ran out. The liver couldn't process proteins anymore. Ammonia spilled into the blood, possibly shutting down their brains. And when the body tried to use fats to produce energy, the lipids backed up and started flooding the cells. All of this happening everywhere in the body, but most visible in the liver. This gives doctors and public health investigators more clues as to what happened. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Every cell has thousands of them, and they produce energy through a huge series of chemical reactions, and by exploiting electrochemical differences. Because this process is so long and so complex, with so many moving parts, it means that there's a high potential for exogenous substances to disrupt any single part, shutting down the entire process. For example, cyanide shuts down electrical activity here in the mitochondria, starving cells of energy. Aspirin in very large doses dissipates the electrochemical difference, preventing the final step of energy production. And a medicine used for seizures and migraine, among other ailments, known as valproic acid, can sometimes stop the processing of fats for energy in the mitochondria and causing fats to spill out into the cell. But none of these substances were in the fermented corn noodles that the family ate, so what exactly was there? When the 4 family members presented to the emergency room, doctors had pumped their stomachs. At the time, they weren't sure exactly what happened, and this was a measure that could possibly mitigate some of the issues that they were having. Public health investigators examined that fluid and compared it to the findings from the samples of noodles that they collected at the house. And what they found told them everything that they needed to know. One bacteria that can appear on corn is Burkholderia gladioli. It's found in soil. Investigators didn't find this bacteria on the noodle samples, and that should make sense because the noodles were cooked, and cooking kills bacteria. But investigators knew it was present on these noodles at some point after they were frozen and before they were eaten by the family, because on the surface they detected something that's made only by Burkholderia gladioli when it's on fermenting corn. This toxin is heat stable. Cooking doesn't destroy it, it doesn't smell, and it doesn't change the color of the food that it's on. Extremely small amounts of this toxin shuts down all of the organs, starting with the liver, the kidneys, and then the brain, while causing permanent damage. And unfortunately for the family, this toxin was found all over the noodles, and it was found in the stomach pump fluid collected from DC, BC, SC, and MC in an amount 33 times the known lethal dose. This toxin is named bonchrecic acid. At this realization, doctors and public health officials needed to speak with MC about how these leftover noodles were prepared this time, but they can't get any answers from her because she was unconscious with multi-organ failure. Bonchrecic acid doesn't interfere with energy production, but rather it prevents adenosine triphosphate, the molecule that cells use for energy, from being released. This mechanism is so delicate that there's a different toxin that does the same thing, but on the opposite side of the membrane. The buildup of ATP inside the mitochondria causes a backup of energy and confuses the body, thinking that there's no energy available, when in reality, it was made, it just can't be released. And this disruption of normal function causes a congestion, which in the liver manifested as fatty deposits on CT scan, but actually appears in every single organ, quickly shutting everything down. Cells can't perform any function, and they quickly cease to exist. But why does Burkholderia gladioli make bonchrecic acid on fermented corn? When you look at the chemical structure, bonchrecic acid looks like a fat. Corn and coconut contain very specific fats. When Burkholderia gladioli starts growing on these fermented foods, it takes these fats and naturally starts to make bonchrecic acid. The toxin appears to have some antifungal properties that eliminates the fermenting yeast, but the side effect of eating this would be that it can eliminate humans too. This has been known for hundreds of years. In Indonesia, a dish known as tempeh is usually prepared from fermented soybeans, but a variation known as tempeh bongkrek is made from fermented coconut. In the 1930s, during economic downturn, people started to make their own tempeh bongkrek from abundant coconuts rather than buy it prepared from experienced producers. The inexperience in preparation would manifest as a fatal food poisoning, which started to happen so frequently that 2 Dutch scientists set out to examine why it was happening. They identified that a bacteria named Pseudomonas cocovenenans had grown on the fermented coconut and had made 3 different chemicals, the most toxic one known now as bonchrecic acid. When the genes of Pseudomonas cocovenenans was analyzed several years later, it was renamed to Burkholderia gladioli pathovar cocovenenans. This bacteria is commonly found on plants and soil, but soybean tempeh and grain and oat tempeh can't be contaminated by it because none of these have the same fatty acid composition, inhibiting growth of Burkholderia gladioli and preventing the production of bonchrecic acid. Although some reports have come out showing a possible association with bonchrecic acid in soaked mushrooms and wet rice noodles, Because Burkholderia gladioli is ubiquitous in soil, it's possible that these mushrooms and certain rice can have some of the same lipid profile to encourage the bacterial growth and toxin production, but this is likely very uncommon. Improperly stored leftover rice and pasta can grow a different bacteria named Bacillus cereus, of which mutated forms can produce a toxin known as cereulide, which directly disrupts energy production upstream the process where boncrecic acid acts. While the Indonesian poisonings came from a coconut-based dish, DC, MC, BC, and SC's corn-based dish isn't isolated. At a funeral in 2015, Mozambique, a woman had brewed a corn-based, local, traditional beer to serve to attendees. Before the funeral was over, 267 people had consumed this beer, and symptoms of abdominal pain and malaise appeared within minutes to hours before psychomotor agitation and abnormal posturing preceded death in 75 people. The woman who had prepared the beer delivered it at 6 a.m. before the funeral started. She was not seen after the delivery, and at 2 a.m. the following morning, she was found not alive in her house, being one of the first casualties. Post-mortem analysis of patients revealed that fluid had filled their lungs, that parts of their kidneys, stomach, and pancreas had necrosed. Their heart had turned bright red, and their brain had swelled with so much fluid that it folded on itself inside their skull, and fatty deposits had formed all throughout their liver. All of this coming from a disruption of cellular energy release due to a toxin. The brain damage probably wasn't just because of ammonia from the liver. It appears that it was damaged directly by the boncrecic acid. This multi-organ shutdown happened on the order of hours after consuming the corn beer, just like DC, MC, BC, and SC after they had consumed their 1-year-old frozen, leftover, fermented corn noodle breakfast. DC, the dad, was the first to start to have seizures. After each seizure, his posture became more abnormal before his heart stopped beating, and the medical team wasn't able to resuscitate him. There's no antidote for boncrecic acid poisoning. The best that the hospital could do was to treat the family's symptoms. As best as the medical team could try, the amount of boncrecic acid that was consumed was so far above the known lethal dose that there wasn't much more for them to do. In America, despite growing and consuming so much corn, we don't really have fermented corn foods or drinks, nor do we have that many popular fermented coconut dishes, and certainly almost none of these are homemade. But Burkholderia gladioli is in North America. It can infect humans often when the person has immunocompromise, or in the setting of cystic fibrosis, where the patient has a genetic mutation that causes their mucus to be extra thick, disrupting flow in the body. Analysis of Burkholderia gladioli pathovar coccoveninans genes has revealed that strains on all continents contain the gene that produces boncrecic acid, meaning that should corn or coconut be fermented anywhere on Earth, this poisoning can happen. And it still happens today. In Taiwan, in 2024, there was a report of a food poisoning outbreak from a restaurant where 36 people got ill. When investigators looked closer, they found boncrecic acid. A chef might have handled food that was contaminated with the toxin that resulted in at least 5 fatalities. Or it's the food that might have been improperly processed in a way where Burkholderia gladioli contaminated it with produced toxin. When public health authorities responded to the initial report of this family, they quickly found the boncrecic acid culprit and notified the public. Reports of this particular case instantly reached all around the world. In Indonesia, tempeh bangkrek production was banned in 1988, but it doesn't mean that it isn't being produced at all. It still is. They can't stop local people from doing it in their homes. But in this particular case, swantangzi production can still often be homemade because it's a traditional local dish, and enforcing any possible ban would likely prove very difficult. Whether or not you come into contact with fermented corn or fermented coconut dishes, please be careful with frozen leftovers. It's not to scare you from all food. I just want to remind you to be safe with the food that you have. Refrigerate promptly within 3 hours. Don't leave food in the refrigerator for more than a few days. Don't take it out and leave it out for a day and then put it back in. Frozen foods can still go bad, and when preparing food, make sure that utensils, the kitchen, and your hands are clean. Sometimes it's not microbes that get you sick, but rather toxins made by the microbes that contaminated the food that can make you sick. And if you do come in contact with fermented corn or fermented coconut dishes, please just check to make sure that they were made by an experienced producer. This family's case was an accident. At autopsy for DC, MC, BC, and SC, pathological findings were consistent with boncrecic acid poisoning, fatty liver, brain herniation, and red and congested organs with widespread focal necrosis were found because the toxin shut down all energy released from the cells, causing widespread dysfunction and ending with this outcome. Because Ace was the only one who didn't eat the 1-year-old frozen leftover sour soup fermented corn noodles that day, he was the only one who survived. Thanks so much for watching. Take care of yourself and be well. A man consumed a 2-week-old baked potato for dinner.
Stealing my wing and
This is
my
what
eye.
happened to his brain.
Yet,
PD is a 36-year-old man presenting to the emergency room with slurred speech and blurred vision. He mumbles to the admitting nurse that he knew something was wrong when he felt air moving through his guts, but what actually came out wasn't air. PD was a new prison inmate. He was instructed to save food scraps from the cafeteria. Another inmate was using these to make pruno in the toilet of his cell. This prison wine was forbidden and could lengthen the sentence of everyone involved, but they didn't care. It helped keep things at peace in the facility. They'd save up oranges, grapefruits, and canned fruit so they could crush them up and filter the juice through a sock. They'd mix it with hot water from the sink into a plastic bag. Every day, the brewer would burp the bag, releasing gas made by the microorganisms as the mixture ferments. Hiding it from the guards, he'd heat the bag under hot water from his cell sink every day. This communal effort gave inmates something to pass the time, but one day, something was wrong. The master brewer got an idea. The cafeteria started serving baked potatoes. Starch is sugar, and sugar's used to make the wine, so adding these potatoes would help fermentation go faster, he thought. The master brewer inmate told everyone to start stashing these. When it was time to make some wine, he'd peel these with his fingernail to make his batch. These would get saved up for weeks. One evening, PD didn't eat enough for dinner. When he was supposed to be sleeping, he looked at his savings to eat. All that was left were baked potatoes from at least 2 weeks ago. Despite the smell and the taste, he ate it and washed it down with a cup of prison wine that he had saved that was also made from these potatoes. In the morning, PD noticed something was wrong when his mouth felt weird. He would try to stick his tongue out, but it felt like the muscles in his mouth were stiff. It seemed like his throat was closing up and his breath felt hot. At breakfast, he thought he had to burp, but much more than just air came up. He wasn't sure if his vision was doubling, but what was doubling was the liquid exiting his body because it was coming out of both ends. When the jail physician arrived, they examined PD. If the food in the cafeteria suddenly changed, causing him to eat things that he hadn't had for a while, all of this looks like an allergic reaction. The physician noted that another inmate down the hall was experiencing the same symptoms. Looks like this is environmental. They didn't know about the 2-week-old baked potato and didn't know about the prison wine. PD was given some diphenhydramine, Benadryl. Allergic reactions happen because of a release of histamine by white blood cells. This is a reaction by the immune system because the body detects and reacts to something that it's not familiar with. Histamine dilates blood vessels, causing swelling, explaining PD's throat closing up. It causes low blood pressure, causing him to be dizzy and lightheaded. Diphenhydramine stops the body from reacting to histamine, stopping the allergic reaction. And it should work for PD. He swallowed the tablets, but he had trouble doing that. As the day passed, PD noticed things on the far side of his field of vision were doubling. He could feel pins and needles in his hands and feet. He started choking on his spit. on the floor in his cell. He begs for one of the guards to call for help, but his voice was weak. The jail physician realizes that something is happening as PD's brought to the emergency room, where we are now. At examination, the medical team notes that PD is slurring his words. He tells them about a 2-week-old baked potato that he ate for dinner. The prison guard mentioned that his voice was much weaker than normal, and doctors find that his breathing was shallow, but they couldn't hear any noises from his lungs, so it doesn't seem like he has any blockages or swelling in his airway. What they did notice was that PD had a lot of gas. The air that he was producing and releasing was so foul and enough to prompt the nurse to give him some liquid to help relieve it. PD sips on this mix, but over the next 2 hours, he can't finish it because he can no longer swallow. He can't tell the nurse about this because he's now unable to speak. PD tries to communicate with the team in writing. They notice that his eyelids were drooping. Typically, when light is shined into the eyes, the pupils constrict so that it limits the amount of light entering in. This reflex indicates that the brain and the nerves are intact, but when they shine a light into his eyes, his pupils are very slow to react. When they ask him to move his eyes, they notice that it's easy for him to look right, but not left. When they look at his throat, they find that it's not swollen at all, but rather, it looks like the muscles there are paralyzed. At 48 hours after eating and drinking a 2-week-old baked potato, PD is no longer able to breathe for himself. The medical team saw this decline happen. They put a tube down his throat so that a machine can breathe for him as he's admitted into the intensive care unit. When they send him in for a scan of his brain, it returned normal. Nothing was wrong. Given that PD's breathing isn't due to an airway obstruction, that his movement and his speaking are both impaired, and that the muscles of his eyes were weak, all of these are controlled by the brain. But if the scan doesn't show anything wrong with it, then what's happening? The brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system. It's responsible for the senses, which were intact for PD, demonstrating again that PD's brain was intact. So something else is happening somewhere else. His problem is acute in nature. He's not experiencing a chronic neurodegenerative disorder like amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, since that takes more than 2 days to happen. PD's weakness was symmetric, meaning it was the same on both sides. It developed from his eyes and his throat to his chest, then from his arms to his hands and his legs to his feet, something called a descending pattern. Ascending pattern is one coming up from the fingertips up to the arms and from the feet to the legs. That's something that can be seen from some heavy metal poisonings like thallium. This means that his problems could be just his nerves, but which nerves? You can't say it's just 1 or 2 of them because all the way from his eyes down to his feet on both sides of his body are paralyzed, covering a huge number of nerves. It's unlikely that all of them are failing independently at the same time. Moving up, his spinal cord is fine, and that's controlled by his brain, which is also fine, and that leaves us with the muscles as the problem. Typically, if muscles are physically damaged, they'll leak contents into the blood, and the resulting proteins have a tendency to collect in and shut down the kidneys. Muscle damage like this doesn't always come from a physical insult. It can come from eating the wrong things at the wrong time, like a moldy old potato. But PD's blood test results don't show that his kidneys have shut down, meaning that his muscles aren't physically damaged, and there aren't really any muscle problems that'll affect the eyes, the throat, and the respiratory muscles together. So this isn't a problem of just the muscles. If his brain, nerves, and muscles are all fine independently, then it means that maybe a combination of these is the problem. If the connection between PD's brain and his nerves was damaged, that can cause paralysis. This happens in polio and West Nile, both of which are infections, but PD didn't have a fever. He had no signs of any infection. The remaining place that something could be wrong is where the nerves connect to the muscles. Muscle contraction is a deliberate and motivated function. The brain originates and sends the command, and the nerves facilitate that signal. To communicate with the muscles, chemicals called neurotransmitters are released in this space. Sometimes the part of the muscle that receives the signal is damaged, caused by the immune system, but PD doesn't appear to have that inflammation. Other times, the chemicals are there, but they just can't be released. This would happen because something from outside the body is causing it. This means that it's being caused by a toxin. And the toxic illness that would be associated with a 2-week-old baked potato is botulism. Down the hallway in the hospital, another prison inmate was admitted. This was the inmate that the jail physician told PD was experiencing the same allergic reaction symptoms that he was experiencing. But the hospital wasn't done admitting inmates. Within 24 hours, 6 more prisoners were admitted into the hospital from the same facility, all of them presenting with signs and symptoms of botulism. The state public health authority was notified when PD presented to the emergency room first, and when these additional cases followed him, they knew this was an outbreak. To avoid being in a position where you'll need to eat a 2-week-old baked potato, you can play it safe and healthy by ordering from this video sponsor, Factor. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. They offer delicious, flavor-packed options on the menu every week to fit a variety of lifestyles, from keto to calorie smart, vegan and veggie, and protein plus. Food prep and variety is tough for me, so I get myself a box every week, but I also get Factor for my dad. He's getting older now, and sometimes isn't consistent with portion control, but he gets Factor now and loves it. In any given day, I know he's eaten, what he's eaten, and how much. Every week he tells me which meals to select for him for the delivery. He really likes Factor's keto meals, like this Chipotle rub pork chop. Not only do I enjoy the meals, this is my lunch every day, but it gives me peace of mind to know that my dad is eating healthy and portion controlled. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code EMU50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next box. That's EMU50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next box while your subscription is active. We highly recommend it. Botulism is caused by botulinum toxin, which is a protein. One of the most potent known toxins in humans, meaning that the smallest doses can be fatal. But what does this have to do with potatoes? Well, botulinum toxin is made by a bacteria known as Clostridium botulinum. The problem with this is that this bacteria is everywhere. It's prominently found in soil. Knowing that potatoes are the part of the plant that grows underground, then it means that they're covered with Clostridium botulinum. But why doesn't everyone who eats a potato get botulism? Well, the bacteria doesn't always make toxin. Actually, it needs to be in very specific conditions to do it. Warm, moist, low oxygen, low salt, low acid, and low sugar all need to happen at the same time for some time. But when we're looking at a baked potato wrapped in aluminum foil and stashed away in a prison cell for several weeks, that is all those conditions at the same time. The problem is, when the state health department asked the jail cafeteria what kind of potatoes they were preparing, none of them were wrapped in aluminum foil. When the prison guards found more potatoes in the cells, they tested all of them, and none of them had botulinum toxin. Eating a 2-week-old potato is kinda gross, but it doesn't appear to be the cause of PD's problem. The brewer inmate used a sock to filter the prison wine that he made. Prison guards found this sock in his cell. It was still moist. They sent it to the laboratory, and when the test returned, it was positive for Clostridium botulinum. The prison started asking all the inmates about this. They promised each one that there would be no punishment if they admitted to drinking prison wine. One inmate who had some wine but wasn't admitted to the hospital told the guards that he took a small sip from this batch and immediately spat it out because it was repulsive. The reality is, Pruno, this prison wine, looks repulsive, but this inmate told them more. Multiple batches were made by the brewer. It just so happened that the wine in this cup that this inmate spat out was the one that was made with a 2-week-old baked potato. No other batches contained this ingredient. Knowing that potatoes have Clostridium bacteria and spores all over by default, and knowing that the fermented mash is low oxygen, low acidity, low sugar, because prisons sometimes deliberately make pure sugar very hard to get in order to prevent this from being made, then this gave the bacteria from the potato an impetus to produce botulinum toxin. Pruno is not allowed to be produced in prisons, but saying that isn't going to stop people from making it. There's videos that will say that there's a risk of botulism when producing something similar at home, and it's right, but foods that might have botulism range from vegetables that have contact with the soil like garlic and chilies. But remember, those vegetables need to be in an environment that would cause the bacteria to make the toxin. Often, if this does happen, it's when foods get canned incorrectly, or when they get fermented incorrectly. Other times, this has appeared in certain fish and meat products, and mysteriously in gas station nacho cheese. It's important to remember that this bacteria is everywhere, but it takes very specific circumstances for it to make toxin, and these circumstances are rarely sustained for long enough to accumulate enough toxin. For PD, the medical team had taken a blood test when he presented to the emergency room. By then, they had already suspected botulism based on what the jail physician had told them. Before the results of the test returned days later, they had administered botulinum antitoxin. This is supposed to help mitigate the problems that come with getting botulism. It cannot reverse the damage that's already been done, but what damage would that be? Botulism is a neuroparalytic syndrome. Given enough time, the body does eventually clear it all out of the neuromuscular junction, allowing the nerves and the muscles to communicate again. Botox is botulinum toxin, and you'll see this is why people need repeat administration of it. The problem is, humans cannot last for days without being able to breathe, which is how botulism is fatal. It suffocates you. Modern medicine has been able to solve this by sticking a tube down the patient's throat so that a machine can breathe for them. But long-term damage from botulism is something that modern medicine can't fully solve just yet. Once the toxin clears out of the neuromuscular junction, that connection is usually fully intact. Most of the time, there isn't any long-term problems, but not moving for several months causes a different set of problems. Muscles shorten, they atrophy. Extensive physical therapy is needed, and patients can fatigue easily. Sometimes patients will have trouble breathing like they did before they got sick and will easily get shortness of breath. Other times there's other long-term effects, like in this case, one of the 8 patients continued to have double vision for at least a year afterwards. All of this means for PD and his fellow inmates, the treatment after antitoxin is supportive care. The machine will breathe for them as the toxin slowly clears out of their neuromuscular junction. The intensive care unit can fully control most every vital function of the body to treat any symptoms that they might have during this time. All of this cost money. When it happened in 2011, the state taxpayers footed the bill of $500,000 US. With the way that this reads, you tell me if that's just the hospital bill. And then additionally, the secure transport of these patients to the hospital, correctional facility monitoring while these patients were admitted into the hospital. Let's be real, I don't think they could have run away if they really had botulism. And of course, all the health departments who were involved in the investigation, those people could have been working on something else in lieu of this as an additional cost. The lesson here is to be careful when you're processing foods yourself. The bacteria that makes botulinum toxin is everywhere, but it needs to be in the right conditions for a prolonged period of time to make the toxin. Nothing wrong with baked potatoes. Baking in the foil and leaving them out for a long period of time could cause problems, but in this case, it wasn't eating the 2-week-old baked potato that caused PD's problem because it wasn't wrapped in foil, but rather he drank prison wine made with the 2-week-old baked potato. And the fermentation process allowed the Clostridium to make botulinum toxin. Botulism is rare. When it happens from commercial products, it always sounds kind of funny, but what actually happens afterwards isn't fun. Luckily for PD, with supportive care, after 58 days, he was able to clear the toxin out of his neuromuscular junction. At 11 months after this outbreak, he did still have some weakness and trouble swallowing that got better over time as he was able to make a full recovery. Thanks so much for watching. Take care of yourself and be well.
Yes?
Gods be
Try not
with
to
you.
hurt yourself.
Stay safe. Where are you going?
Farewell.
I cannot do that. I cannot do that. Fools! Fools!
What brings you here? Eterra's grace be with you.
I cannot do that. I am not a man of many pockets.
them off me. Only a little longer. You there, help me. Keep them off me. Only a little longer. You there, help me.
Cannot do that.
Impressive. Go on. I'll be right behind you.
I see.
What? Go on then. Bah.
Yes?
I cannot wear this.
follow your feet.
May a terror smile upon you.
You. I can sense that you have a shard of the Epoch. I see. We have relied on... You were brought forward in time. The void... Now that the Elder Panion is an... I have received word that they are the shard. It was... We thought everyone... Please, please. The gods have long left this world, but their memory will give you comfort. Be safe, traveler.
I cannot do that.
Yes? Farewell.
Gods.
I once believed that with only... What happened when I tapped into this power? Why did one shard come with me?
I can...
It turns out here, I will guard what little of the Epoch I have left, and find a way to protect us. This is not the end. as quickly as I hear. I am disturbed by this era, but it is not a mistake. It is the
I cannot do that. I cannot do that. I cannot do that.
If you read this, I trust you all. You are my people, which is why I must go.
I can. I am not a man of many pockets.
Gods be with you.
Yes? Follow your feet.
Bit cool, something I've wanted to do for a long time, and that is a returns pallet. So I've come down to Stockport.